Alright guys, this will be video 1 for APUSH on Tuesday, April 21st. We're wrapping up Reconstruction, finishing up this review packet 5 and moving on to packet 6. Okay, so I'm on PDF page 180, finishing up after Redeemers. The election of 1876 was one of the more infamously contested elections in American history, with both political parties accusing the other of fraud. Samuel J. Tilden, then governor of New York and a political reformer who had gone after Boss Tweed, the most notorious among the political bosses at the time, won the popular vote by a small margin but needed to win the electoral vote to gain the presidency. Republicans challenged the election returns that favored Tilden in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. Congress eventually stepped in to resolve the disputed election and create a special bipartisan electoral commission consisting of senators, representatives, and Supreme Court justices. Through a series of informal negotiations, a deal was struck that has become known as the Compromise of 1877. It was agreed that if Rutherford B. Hayes won the presidential election, he would end military reconstruction and pull federal troops out of South Carolina and Louisiana, thereby enabling Democrats to regain control of those states. Military reconstruction was thus ended, and it was business as usual in the South. Many historians feel the federal government dropped the ball in 1877 for many ways. Life for blacks got worse, and it would take another 100 years for the federal government to live up to the ideal expressed in the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal. All right, this last little portion: Southern blacks during and after Reconstruction. At the end of the Civil War, the former slaves were thrust into an ambiguous state of freedom. Most reacted cautiously, remaining on plantations as sharecroppers would have been relatively well treated, but fleeing from those with cruel overseers. Many set out in search of family members from whom they had been separated. The Freedmen's Bureau helped them find new jobs and housing, provided money and food to those in need. The Freedmen's Bureau also helped establish schools at all levels for blacks, among them Fisk University and Howard University. Unfortunately, the Freedmen's Bureau was terribly underfunded and had little impact once military reconstruction came to an end. When it became evident the government would not redistribute land, blacks looked for other ways to work on their own farms. The Freedmen's Bureau attempted to establish a system in which blacks contracted their labor to whites, but the system failed. Instead, blacks preferred sharecropping, in which they traded a portion of their crop in return for the right to work someone else's land. The system worked at first, but unscrupulous landowners eventually used the system as a means of keeping poor farmers in a state of near slavery and debt. Abuses of sharecropping system grew more widespread at the end of Reconstruction, at which point no court would fairly try the case of sharecropper against a landowner. Sharecropping existed well into the middle of the 20th century and actually included more whites than blacks. Disenchantment with white society led many freedmen to found communities as far removed from the sphere of whites as possible. Black churches continued to serve as another means by which the black community could bond and gain further autonomy. When Reconstruction ended, many blacks anticipated the fate that awaited them in the South and left. The Great Migration into northern cities like Chicago and Detroit would not take place until World War I. And that's going to end Packet 5, so we're finishing up Unit and Packet 5. We're now moving into the AP Course Guidebook Unit 6, which is basically the last 30 years or 40 years of the 1800s, wrapping up the 1800s as a century. So this chapter in the Princeton Review book is called The Machine Age, 1877 to 1900. All right, we're going to scroll down here and get started reading on that. Is this required? There we go. All right. Age of Invention and Economic Growth. In 1876, Thomas Edison built his workshop in Menlo Park, New Jersey, and proceeded to produce some of the most important inventions of the century. Edison's great invention was the light bulb. Edison's pioneering work in the development of power plants also proved immensely important. His advances allowed for the extension of the workday, which previously ended at sundown, and wider availability of electricity. With the wider availability, Edison and other inventors began to create new uses for electricity, both for industry and at home. The last quarter of the 19th century is often called the Age of Invention because so many technological advances like Edison's were made. These advances in turn generated greater opportunities for mass production, which then caused the economy to grow at a tremendous rate. Not surprisingly, the people known as the captains of industry to their fans and robber barons to others, who owned and controlled the new manufacturing enterprises, became extremely rich and powerful during this period. Our industrialization and corporate consolidation, gospel of wealth. As more and faster machines became available to manufacturers, businessmen discovered that their cost per unit decreased as the number of units they produced increased. The more raw product they bought, the cheaper the supplier's asking price. The closer to capacity they kept their new, faster machines running, the less cost of labor and electricity per product. The lower their cost, the cheaper they could sell their products. The cheaper the product, the more they sold. That, simply put, is the concept of economies of scale, and basically makes goods available for more people because they're now cheaper. The downside of this new business practice was that it required employees to work as efficiently and repetitively as machines. Assembly line production had begun to take hold when Eli Whitney developed interchangeable parts, but reached a whole new level in Ford's plants in the early 20th century. This type of production required workers to perform a single task over and over, often for 12 to 14 hours a day. Factories were dangerous. Machine malfunctions and human error typically resulted in more than 500,000 injuries to workers per year. The overriding concern for businessmen, however, was that profits continued to increase by huge margins. Although the government made some efforts to regulate this rapid growth, these were tentative. Furthermore, the government remained uncertain as to how to enforce regulations, and widespread corruption existed among those bureaucrats charged with enforcing regulations. Finally, the courts of the era, especially the Supreme Court, were extremely pro-business with almost no restraint. Businesses such as railroad companies followed the path that led to greater economies of scale, which meant larger and larger businesses. This was known as the corporate consolidation. One new form of business organization was called a holding company. A holding company owned enough stock in various companies to have controlling interest in the production of raw material, the means of transporting that material to a factory and the factory itself, and the distribution network of selling the product. The logical conclusion is monopoly or complete control of the entire industry. One holding company, for example, gained control of 98% of the sugar refining plants in the United States. While the company did not control the entire sugar industry, it did control one very important aspect of it. The most common forms of business consolidation at the end of the 19th century was horizontal and vertical integration. One is legal, one is not. Both were practiced by captains of industry during the Gilded Age. For all intents and purposes, horizontal integration created monopolies within a particular industry, the best known example being Standard Oil, created by John D. Rockefeller. In horizontal integration, several smaller companies within the same industry are combined to form one larger company, either by being bought out legally or by being destroyed through ruthless business practices such as cutthroat competition or pooling agreements. Many of these business practices are illegal today because of antitrust legislation passed at the turn of the century. Vertical integration remains legal, however, provided the company does not become either a trust or a holding company, but rather allows other companies in the same industry to survive and compete in the marketplace. In vertical integration, one company buys out all the factories of production, from raw materials to finished product. For example, Swift Premium might control the stockyards, the slaughterhouse, and the processing packaging plant, but still compete with Oscar Mayer or Hebrew National. Numerous problems arose because of consolidation of power. First, rapid growth required lots of money. Businessmen borrowed huge sums, and when their businesses occasionally failed, bank failures could result. During the last quarter of the 19th century, the United States endured one major financial panic per decade. Although irresponsible investors caused the panics, the lower classes suffered the most as jobs and money became scarce. Second, monopolies created a class of extremely powerful men whose interests clashed with those of the rest of society. As these businessmen grew more powerful, public resentment increased and government responded with laws to restrict monopolies, with the courts, in turn, weakened. Back and forth battle among the public, the government, and courts is best exemplified by the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Public pressure led to the passage of the law forbidding any combination or conspiracy in the restraint of trade. Unfortunately, the wording of Sherman Antitrust Act was ambiguous enough to allow the pro-business Supreme Court at the time to interpret the law as it saw fit. For example, in 1895, the court ruled that the E.C. Knight, a company that controlled 98% of the sugar refining plants in the United States, did not violate the Sherman Antitrust Act because local manufacturing was not subject to congressional regulation of interstate commerce. This is U.S. versus E.C. Knight Company, Supreme Court case. On the other hand, labor unions were often found to be in restraint of free labor and declared illegal. This loophole was closed during Wilson's administration in 1914 with the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act, which made allowances for collective bargaining. Another response to public pressure from reform came from the industrialists themselves. Steel mogul Andrew Carnegie promoted a philosophy based on the work of Charles Darwin. Using Darwin's theory of evolution as an analogy, Carnegie argued that in business, as in nature, unrestricted competition allowed only the fittest to survive. This theory was called social Darwinism. Aside from the fact that Carnegie's analogy to Darwin's theory was at best dubious, it also lacked consistency. While Carnegie argued against government regulation, he supported all types of government assistance to businesses in the form of tax abatements, grants, and tariffs. Carnegie further argued that the concentration of wealth among a few was the natural and most efficient result of capitalism. Carnegie also asserted that great wealth brought with it social responsibility, doubling his belief in the gospel of wealth. He advocated philanthropy as by building libraries and museums or funding medical research, but not charity. Some of his peers were as generous, but others were not. We'll end video.